Thinking about Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, thinking about him today, I was thinking about the tradition that the Muslims have of the Tawabin, the repenters. There's a long tradition, it's a literary tradition, there are books written about the great repenters, people that had sinful lives and then they turned those lives around. And that's really at the essence of his story. People, I think, know different things about Malcolm's life, but something that really he constantly drew from was his own experience. And he never abandoned that understanding. Some people will try to hide the past and pretend like it never happened, but he was somebody who embraced the shadow, that he was able to understand what his life was before it was redeemed. And what redeemed his life really was knowledge. And this is where I think it's crucial for us to understand that whenever we see crises anywhere in the world, it's fundamentally and ultimately a crisis of knowledge. And by knowledge, because you have to Allahu Akbar, you have to explain your terms. By knowledge here, I'm not simply talking about information. I'm talking about tahqiq, real knowledge, knowledge that's realized in the heart, a true knowledge. And that true knowledge is what enables people to rectify themselves. If they don't have that true knowledge, then they're not able to rectify themselves. If they can't rectify themselves, they certainly will not rectify the world. And one of the things that one of our poets said, that إِذَا لَمْ يَكُونَ عَوْنَ اللَّهِ لِلْعَبْدِ, if a servant does not have help from God, أَكْثَرُ مَا يَجْنِي عَلَيْهِ اجْتِهَادُهُ, the thing that will harm him most is his own efforts. And so understanding that we need God and in our lives, we need that guidance. But that guidance has to be with knowledge, because the most heinous crimes are done in the name of God when there's no knowledge. They say evil people can do evil things, but it takes religion to enable good people to do evil things. And there's a lot of truth to that, but it's always religion that is out of ignorance. Looking at his insatiable appetite for knowledge, one of the things that all of us will experience in our lives is we all have appetitive awakenings. A child comes into the world wanting to suckle at the breast. This is really the first awakening, the awakening of the concupiscible soul, the appetitive soul. And then you have the emotional, the irascible soul awakes. The child gets angry. The child begins to experience emotions. But the third awakening is the intellectual awakening. And unfortunately for many people that never happens. It really doesn't. They do not have intellectual awakenings. And by intellectual awakening, I'm not talking about knowledge that you read in books. It's actually the real, what the intellect is, the aql, this illuminated faculty that we have been given from God to understand reality. That awakening is something that has different aspects to it, and one of them is what are called the intelligibles or the ma'qulat, beginning to understand the world and what it means and what's around you. So it took a prison experience for this awakening to occur in Malcolm. When he was a young boy, and he had a good grammar education. What's interesting, he had 8 years, and we have to remember that 8 years, if you studied in the 20s and the 30s, you got grammar. So he learned grammar because they called it grammar school. So he would have known what a noun is, what a verb is, what a subject, what a predicate, a main clause. He would have known these things. And he did very well in school, but he dropped out. He was discouraged from intellectual pursuit and told to pursue carpentry, which was appropriate for his color. He ended up, and people know the story, I'm not going to go into the story, but when he got to prison, there was a man there that really struck him. And Malcolm was foul-mouthed, which is very common in the criminal classes, where every other word is a swear word. He was foul-mouthed, but there was a man there who he affectionately calls Bembi. This man was somebody who never swore, and he was struck by his command of language and the respect that he commanded through language. And one of the things that he told him to do was he should take advantage of the library and the correspondence at the prison while he was there. And this is the beginning of his intellectual awakening. But when he begins to be exposed to the ideas of Elijah Muhammad and the nation, he starts writing letters. And what struck him was his inability to articulate in his letters. He was frustrated by the fact that he didn't have the words, and also his penmanship was poor. But he was sending out these letters he sent them to leaders in the community, he sent them to some of his old hustler friends, and he said he didn't get any replies to these letters, but he was frustrated. But most of all, he was frustrated at his inability to write well to Elijah Muhammad. And so what he did, he said it was the letter writing that wanted him to become better educated. And he says, I became increasingly frustrated at not being able to express what I wanted to convey in letters that I wrote, especially those to Mr. Elijah Muhammad. In the street, I had been the most articulate hustler out there. I had commanded attention when I said something. But now, trying to write simple English, I not only wasn't articulate, I wasn't even functional. How could I sound writing in slang the way I would say it, something such as, look, Daddy, let me pull your coat about a cat, Elijah Muhammad. Many people today and that's quite eloquent in its own, he's got some nice metaphor there, pull your coat, get your attention, right? And then he says, many people today who hear me somewhere in person or on television, or those who read something I've said, will think I went to school far beyond the 8th grade. This impression is due entirely to my prison studies. He then says that every book I picked up had few sentences which didn't contain anywhere from one to nearly all the words that might as well have been in Chinese. So he's trying to read, but he doesn't have the words. And so what does he do? He gets a dictionary. And he begins to copy out the dictionary because he said that he wanted to improve his penmanship so he could write better letters, but he wanted to know the words. What's so stunning about this is that this is what Adam was taught. He was taught the words. It is words that make us human. It's the ability to articulate with words that make us human. And so he set out to learn words, and he wrote that entire dictionary out by hand. And he said it was like an encyclopedia for him. I suppose it was inevitable that as my word base broadened, I could for the first time pick up a book and read and now begin to understand what the book was saying. Anyone who has read a great deal can imagine the new world that opened. Let me tell you something. From then until I left prison, in every free moment I had, if I was not reading in the library, I was reading on my bunk. You couldn't have gotten me out of the books with a wedge. Months passed without even thinking about being imprisoned. In fact, up to then, I had never been so truly free in my life. I mean, that is a stunning statement because his mind was opening up. And this is, the real prison is here. You know, I recently I spoke to some inmates, and one of the things I said to them, you can make Hajj here. And many, many people have done that it's not a valid Hajj in terms of fulfilling your requirements, so don't get me wrong. But there are people that travel to Mecca in their minds, and they experience being there. This is the power of the mind. Khayal, what's called khayal in our tradition. One of the things that he said is that there were Harvard professors and professors from Boston University that were coming in, and this is happening. Chris Hedges, a Harvard graduate, teaches in prison. Cornel West, a Harvard professor, teaches in prison. So there are people from these universities that go into prisons and teach. He was exposed to Harvard professors from Boston University. He said they had inmate debates, and he says, you would be astonished to know how worked up convict debaters and audience would get over subjects like, should babies be fed milk? You see, because this is the intellectual awakening that took place. And he says that there were a sizable number of well-read inmates, especially the popular debaters. Some were said to be practically walking encyclopedias. They were almost celebrities. No university would ask any student to devour literature as I did when this new world opened up to me of being able to read and understand. And that's the key, to read and understand, because we have a whole nation of people that can read but don't necessarily understand. And if you want proof for that, just look at any comments on social media about statements that you just read. And if you understood them, just read down what people have to say, and you'll realize how illiterate our culture is. He said that he read history. He read Will Durant's Story of Civilization, a multi-volume history of the world. He read H.G. Wells' Outline of History. He read Herodotus. He read Arnold Toynbee. And there was a brilliant library that he said would have been the envy of colleges and universities that had been donated to the prison. You can see the divine hand in the education of this man. He said he read philosophy. If you go to Alcatraz and visit Alcatraz, they have a little prison library in there. The books aren't there anymore, but on the wall it says the inmates were particularly interested in philosophy and would check out Kant and other philosophers. He said he read Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. He was particularly struck by Spinoza. And one of the things that he said, that he felt that Western civilization had ended up in a cul-de-sac. And I don't think it could be summed up any better than that, the crises of Western civilization. But he was once asked, he also got into African American history. He read W.E.B. Du Bois. And he read his about the soul of black folks, and also read Carter Woodson's Negro History. He read a 3-volume book on race and sex and race. He also said that he read Mendel's book on genetics several times, particularly passages from it. And he said the book made clear to him that you could not get a black man from a white man, but you could get a white man from a black man, which substantiated his belief that the first human beings were dark, which according to our tradition, Adam, Udmat al-Ard, Adam is tawny, it means dark, and Hawa means black. So it wouldn't be at all inconsistent with our understanding of the first people, and we now know that they were probably from South Africa. So we're all Africans, right? Tell that to the crackers. You're a mutation. Melatonin deficiency. Some people say that that's part of the problem with the behavior, is it's just a deficiency in the... He said an Englishman once asked him what his alma mater was. He replied, books. I once asked my grandfather, my Greek grandfather, what his alma mater was, and he said, Hard Knocks. I said, what college do you go to? I was probably like 8 or 9. He said, the College of Hard Knocks. I thought that was a real college. But my grandfather was a highly educated autodidact. Malcolm was an autodidact. He's in a tradition that we have in our own tradition, although our preferred way of teaching is talaqi with a sheikh, and it's definitely the preferred, but there are many great scholars that were actually autodidacts. Ibn Hazm was one of them. One of the greatest Mauritanian scholars, Muhammad Yahya al-Walati, had no teachers. So we do have a tradition. And one of the miracles of the Prophet ﷺ is that he had no human teachers. His teacher was Jibreel ﷺ. In fact, Abdulaziz al-Dabbagh, they once asked him, because he was illiterate, and yet he was incredibly knowledgeable, they asked him, the Prophet ﷺ said that the scholars are the inheritors of prophecy. What did you inherit from the Prophet? And he said his illiteracy. So he was a miracle. Abdulaziz al-Dabbagh was a miracle because he was illiterate and yet he was given all this knowledge. So this is one of really it's a karama of the amount of knowledge. But this man was a highly educated man who I would argue that he had a far superior education to many of the PhDs and college graduates. He definitely knew rhetoric. He knew logic. You can clearly see his knowledge of logic is displayed constantly in his argumentation, his pointing out fallacies, logical fallacies. Somebody accused him of being a communist. He said, why would you conclude that? And he said, you spoke at the socialist, at some venue of communists in New York. He said, I spoke at Dr. King's church. Does that make me a follower of Dr. King? He said, I spoke last week at the Methodist church. Does that make me a Methodist? Right? This is logic. So when he said, every time I catch a plane, I have with me a book I want to read, right? And that's a lot of books these days. If I weren't out here every day battling the white man, I could spend the rest of my life reading, just satisfying my curiosity, because you can hardly mention anything I'm not curious about. I don't think anyone got more out of prison than I did. In fact, prison enabled me to study far more intensely than I ever would have if my life had gone differently and I had attended some college. I imagine that one of the biggest troubles, listen up, Zaytuna students, one of the biggest troubles with colleges is there are too many distractions. Too much panty raiding, fraternities, and bula bula, and all that. And you have to ask Dr. Mahan what bula bula is, right? Right? Is Dr. Mahan here? Imam Zayd knows what bula bula is. Come on, man. New Haven. Bula bula is like it's the song of the Yaleys when they're going to play Harvard. Like bula bula, right? So too much bula bula, right? There's a lot of bula bula over in Berkeley University right here. But where else but in prison could I have attacked my ignorance by being able to study intensely, sometimes as much as 15 hours a day? So this man did not get to the Oxford Union, where I spoke at the Oxford Union. When I walked in, they give you a standing ovation just for getting there. You don't even have to give a talk after that. You just wave or something. Just because you're at the union, they consider it so prestigious. I mean, this is typical Anglo-Saxon pride. They consider it so prestigious that you've been invited there that you get a standing ovation just for walking in, right? So he was there December 3rd, 1963, a beautiful speech that he gave on extremism. He went toe-to-toe with professors from Oxford. The ovations in that speech were immense. His diction was impeccable. His elocution is beautiful. He did not speak slang. If he spoke slang, it was for rhetorical effect, which is actually a trope in rhetoric, is to use "we was robbed." That's a rhetorical trope that can be used. So Malcolm knew rhetoric, and he used it to great effectiveness. He was an extraordinary orator, but he was an educated mind. And this is what has to be understood. This is not something that came down from heaven like manna. This man struggled with great difficulty to educate himself. And he spent years, he would read till 3 a.m. in prison. He would read with the light of the hall. And every 58 minutes he would go because the guard would come by and they weren't allowed to be up at that time, and he would pretend to be asleep. The guard would leave and he would go back and start reading again. This was Malcolm. So when you see this man, you have to understand that this is not something that just came down. And I would recommend reading the book by Jeff Colvin, Talent is Overrated, because this is a clear argument that has been proven by social science. The talent, this whole idea of these gifted people, all of these gifted people, their great gift is discipline. Their great gift is the ability to struggle against themselves and overcome laziness, overcome the temptations to go the easy way. This is what Malcolm was. He was a highly disciplined individual. He was disciplined morally, he was disciplined intellectually, and he was disciplined spiritually. When his brother Reginald was thrown out, he spent the entire night in prayer. So he was a man of prayer. And these are important things to remember. And finally, in conclusion, it would be difficult to... Malcolm died at 39. It's hard to believe that he was so young when his life was taken away. I mean, that's when the prophets begin, at the age of 40. That's when the intellect really begins to mature, and it reaches its real height, during those years. So we don't know what would have happened, and I'm not going to speculate, but one of the last speeches that he gave, and he stopped using black nationalism in that last period because he was struggling with trying to grapple with what the real problem was. And he recognized that there were whites in Algeria that he met, Berbers that are white that he met, that said they didn't resonate with that word, black nationalism. So he was struggling in himself to find something. But he was asked 1 month before he was killed, what do you think is responsible for race prejudice in the U.S.? And Malcolm said, ignorance and greed, and a skillfully designed program of miseducation that goes right along with the American system of exploitation and oppression. So it takes education to eliminate it. And just because you have colleges and universities does not mean you have education. The colleges and universities in the American educational system are skillfully used to miseducate. I couldn't put it better. Thank you.